The world of motorsports is full of crazy stories. Here are 8 from across different series that you may never have heard of. Episode 1. Defying Donuts. Rally Catalunya, a true staple of the WRC calendar since the 1990s, the famous tarmac roads winding themselves over the Spanish mountains like ribbons, also been the stage for many a titanic battle over the years. The 2002 running was no different, this year being the battleground for some all-time greats including Richard Burns, Marcus Grönholm and the home ground favourite Carlos Sainz. Among these bigger names was a lesser known driver by the name of Gilles Panizzi. Since joining the Peugeot team back in the mid-1990s with his brother Hervé Panizzi as his co-driver, he had proven himself to be an excellent tarmac specialist, having a real knack at being able to guide his Peugeot along the asphalt like a missile. The Tour de Corsa, the most famous of the tarmac events on the WRC calendar, had already been conquered by Panizzi with back-to-back wins in 2000 and 2001. However, he wanted to take the elusive pair, with a win at the other most famous tarmac event at Catalunya. And Panizzi truly rose to the challenge this year, putting in an incredibly strong drive, outright winning every single stage on the first day. And despite the competition putting on a good show, in particular fellow Peugeot driver Richard Burns, there was no stopping Captain Tarmac as he would maintain his lead throughout the rest of the stages in days 2 and 3. And therefore, running through special stage 15, approaching the famous Vildrau hairpin and his upcoming win, he decided to give the fans a little something to remember his victory by. By the look on his brother's face, it seems that Gilles didn't tell Hervé what he was about to do. Despite Panizzi's showboating manoeuvre costing him around 10 seconds, Panizzi would coast over the finish line with an impressive 37-second lead over Peugeot teammate Richard Burns, giving the Frenchman his 5th WRC victory. His win would go on to help bag Peugeot that year's championship too, coincidentally also their 5th such title. It just goes to show that even though speed and consistency are the primary deciding factors when it comes to gauging how successful a racing driver is, there's no harm in having a little fun sometimes. Episode 2. Triple Header. The 1997 Formula 1 season was certainly a turbulent one, this year being characterised by the dogfight between two-time world champion Michael Schumacher racing for Ferrari and rising star Jacques Villeneuve racing for Williams. After a season of the two battling it out, as the championship entered its final race, there was just 1 point between Schumacher and the trailing Villeneuve, with third place Heinz-Harald Frentzen being much further behind at 41 points. The 1 point difference for the championship was going to make the final round a hot one, this year being the European Grand Prix held at Jerez in Spain. Following practice sessions seeing times in the low 1-minute 20s, came qualifying. 12 laps were to be raced, with the fastest being used to decide the driver's grid position. Rather quickly, Jacques Villeneuve would prove to be the most successful in qualifying, setting a solid benchmark of 1 minute and 21.072 seconds. Despite a few faster times being set in practice, no driver was able to beat this time in qualifying. Instead, something rather more impressive would happen. Around 14 minutes after Villeneuve had set his fastest lap, Michael Schumacher would then post a 1 minute and 21.072 seconds, the exact same time. The stopwatches at the time measured to an accuracy of 1,000th of a second, making this matching time very impressive. However, it would get weirder. As the qualifying session was drawing to a close, Villeneuve's teammate Heinz-Harald Frentzen would post his fastest time of, get this, 1 minute and 21.072 seconds. Miraculously, 3 separate top-level drivers had posted the exact same time, which, needless to say, was something of a rarity.
As Michael Schumacher sitting in his car watching the screens, shaking his head and laughing.
Despite the low likelihood of this occurring, there was a clause in the regulations that said that the order in which the time was achieved would dictate the grid order. Therefore, Villeneuve, who posted the time first, would start on pole position in the race, followed by Schumacher in second and Frentzen in third. Of course, this incredible moment would be overshadowed by Michael Schumacher being disqualified from the championship after purposefully ramming Villeneuve to maintain his lead later on in the race, very in character for the German, eventually allowing Villeneuve to take third place and win his maiden world championship. However, despite drama between drivers undoubtedly being the most popular thing to report on in any motorsport, moments like a triple fastest qualifying lap are equally as important, because while there are hundreds of times you can see drivers being on the verge of killing each other, something like this is truly a once-in-a-lifetime event.
Episode 3 Final Destination. Le Mans, perhaps the most prestigious and well-known race the world over, first being raced over a century ago in May of 1923. And since then, a win at Le Mans has become the ultimate form of showmanship in not just motorsports but the auto industry as a whole. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday. The likes of Audi, Peugeot and especially Porsche have all seen great repeated successes at the track over the years, and recently Toyota would join this elite club of Le Mans conquerors, claiming their first win in 2018 and following that with 4 more consecutive victories. However, they very nearly claimed their maiden win 2 whole years before that. The 2016 run-in was like any other year, this time forming the third round of the World Endurance Championship. There would be 3 main manufacturers ahead of the pack in the top category, LMP1, veterans Porsche and Audi, and relative newcomer Toyota with their TS050 hybrid, Toyota the only brand of the 3 to not have won the legendary race up to this point. Despite the conditions being rainy when the flag fell at the hands of Brad Pitt at 3 PM and with a safety car out for the first hour, Toyota were able to put up a very strong showing in the first half of the race, with the number 1 and 2 Porsches and the number 5 and 6 Toyotas trading positions at the front of the pack numerous times, the Audi team having fallen away from pace. And so a dogfight between the 2 Porsches and 2 Toyotas would ensue as night fell. The number 1 Porsche of Brendan Hartley, however, would be the first of the quartet to fall away from contention after a water pump failure. With just 1 Porsche left, the 2 Toyotas were slowly able to build up an advantage as dawn broke, but the number 6 Porsche of Kamui Kobayashi would be the second of the 4 to bow out, due to a damaged floor that would force him down the rankings. This would leave 2 at the top, Kazuki Nakajima in his number 5 Toyota and Neil Yanni in the number 2 Porsche. Going into the final few laps, the Toyota had a solid lead of over a minute on the Porsche. Victory was all but guaranteed. Until it wasn't. 6 minutes until the checkered flag fell, the Toyota would slow to just 120 miles per hour on the Mulsanne straight. This would soon drop to nothing as Nakajima was forced to stop. The number 2 Porsche, to the utter dismay of the Toyota team, wasted no time in overtaking, with Porsche snatching Toyota's maiden win at the last second and claiming their 18th win. While the sister number 6 Toyota would roll over the line in second, Toyota had lost at the last hurdle. It was later determined the issue was, rather embarrassingly, the failure of a connector between the turbocharger and the intercooler, which led to a complete loss of power and boost, a part with a very small price tag all things considered. The car did eventually limp over the finish line with a lap time of over 11 minutes. However, due to the lap exceeding the regulated 6-minute limit, the number 5 Toyota would receive no championship points. Despite such a shocking and heartbreaking end to Toyota's triumphant return to the track, they would later get their justice, claiming their first win at the 2018 running of the event, and yes, following that with 4 more. Still, it just goes to show that even with months and even years of development and a full day of hard driving, It isn't always the big things that can prematurely end a race. Something as small as an intercooler pipe could just as easily ruin your day. Episode 4. Blind Attack. It's pretty inarguable that if you want to be even remotely successful in any form of motorsport, being able to see where you're going is probably quite high on your list of priorities, and the Estonian rally driver Marko Martin probably understands this better than anyone. After having a promising first year with the Ford World Rally team in 2002, in which Martin would place 9th in the drivers' standings, the Estonian was having a fairly good start to his 2003 season with the same team. Following the 5th round Rally Argentina, he found himself in a comfortable but not too impressive 7th position. Rally Acropolis in Greece would follow as the championship's 6th round, an event Martin actually led for a brief time in the previous season, before falling away from the top after a puncture. This time, he wasn't going to let anything stand between him and his maiden victory. And the Estonian proved this right out of the gate. Martin would absolutely fly away in the early stages, gaining a valuable lead over the other drivers with the help of his co-driver Michael Park. But the harsh dirt roads of Greece weren't going to remain quite so accommodating for much longer. As he was racing through the very stage where he got a puncture in 2002, something arguably much worse would befall him after hitting a bump quite harshly.
Whoa, that's a problem.
For most drivers, this would be where you throw in the towel, but not Martin. With his view all but erased, a small slither of light underneath the bonnet being his only window now, his co-driver's pace notes suddenly became all the more precious, and the two would battle on, Park essentially being the eyes and ears of the now blind Martin. The simple act of stopping to secure the bonnet shut would have ate up valuable seconds, so the two decided to just keep going. And turn by turn, the Focus RS ploughed through the rally as if there was nothing wrong. Miraculously, when they reached the end of the stage, not only had they not crashed, but they had only lost a mere 6 seconds and had held on to the lead. With that, they strapped the bonnet down, likely a little more cautiously than usual, and continued on their way. And with a rather uneventful rest of the event, aside from another blind attack, this time thanks to a horrible concoction of dust, the 2003 Rally Acropolis would go on to be Martin's fateful maiden win, and he would go on to finish 5th in the drivers' standings at the end of the season. It will be the first great triumph of a successful yet sadly short-lived partnership between Martin and Park prior to the latter's death at the 2005 Rally of Great Britain. Despite a rather short career in the sport, moments like this truly cemented Martin and Park as one of the great rallying duos of the 2000s. Episode 5. Pure Dumb Luck. The Paris-Dakar Rally remains one of, if not the singular toughest motorsporting events anywhere in the world, taking drivers across the harsh desert terrains of North Africa in a grueling test of willpower and reliability. The 1989 edition was no different, departing the race's namesake of Paris and heading through Spain, Tunisia, Libya for the first time, Niger, Mali, Guinea, and finishing in the race's other namesake, Dakar, on the Atlantic coast of Senegal, for a total distance of 6,730 miles. A total of 473 competitors would start. Among the cars competing was the formidable Peugeot 405 T16, which pushed out an impressive 600 horsepower. After 2 consecutive wins at Dakar in 1987 and 1988, head of Peugeot Talbot Sport Jean Todt wanted to go for the hat-trick. Peugeot's hopes were largely falling on 2 of these 405s. The first was in the hands of 1981 WRC champion Ari Vatanen, and the other in the hands of 6-time Le Mans winner Jackie Ickx. Both had also been victorious at Dakar previously. Ickx had won in 1983 and Vatanen had won in 1987. Both, therefore, were slated for success this year.
Despite some strong competition, primarily in the form of Mitsubishi and Toyota, the Peugeots were dominant right out of the gate, and by the time the race reached Libya, Ickx found himself leading the pack, with Vatanen and Peugeot teammate Guy Freckelin not far behind, helped along by Libyan leader Colonel Gaddafi, kindly offering to refuel all the racers free of charge. What a nice man! As the route reached the border with Niger, the 1-2 of Ickx and Vatanen held a 2-hour lead over third. With them being so far ahead, competition between the two teammates began to rear its head. As the race left Niger, Peugeot held the top 4 positions, though Ickx and Vatanen remained ahead by a long shot. Ickx had managed to hold on to his lead, but Vatanen was taking stage wins too and slowly advancing towards the Belgium, eventually to within just 2 minutes of each other. The two drivers, trying to stay ahead of one another, began to push harder and harder, putting in some amazing times, but also beginning to push the boundaries of safety. Jean Todt, while pleased with Peugeot's domination in the car category, foresaw problems and potential accidents arising if Ickx and Vatanen continued to go flat out. As the race reached Timbuktu in western Mali, therefore, to put a stop to this, he made the fateful decision to flip a coin to decide who would roll over the line first, heads for Ickx and tails for Vatanen. Unfortunately for Ickx, after thousands of miles of hard driving, the coin came up tails, and so with the running order decided, Ickx and Vatanen pulled off the limit, and 6 days later the two of them arrived in Dakar, Vatanen claiming his second Paris-Dakar victory and Peugeot's third, with Ickx rolling across the line in second, mere minutes behind. Unfortunately, Ickx would never see the podium, let alone the top of it, ever again at Dakar. Vatanen, however, would go on to win it again in 1990 and 1991, claiming 4 victories overall. Peugeot, on the other hand, after winning in 1989, would go on to win it one more time in 1990, before leaving rally altogether and shifting their focus onto endurance racing with the eventually successful 905 project. The 1989 Paris-Dakar Rally, despite his immense success across motorsports, is something that will likely remain in Ickx's mind even 35 years on. It just goes to show that, no matter how much effort you put in, something as little as a coin could come along and ruin your chances of victory.
Episode 6. As Hot as It Gets. Texas, a state known for many things, including cowboys, oil, tornadoes, and a lot of the time, very hot weather. Extremes in climate are generally unfavourable for motorsports, and extreme heat may be the worst of all. However, this notion didn't stop the Formula 1 cavalcade making its way to Dallas in 1984 for the 9th round of the World Championship. This was the first running of the event, brought in to push the idea of Dallas being a world city. It was a perfectly well-conceived idea. The layout of the street circuit was generally enjoyed by the drivers, and it would be good for Dallas's publicity. However, the organisers made one massive error. They decided to race it in the middle of July. Even as early as Friday practice, some drivers noted potential issues. The course itself was notably rough, even being described as a rallycross circuit. With the addition of afternoon qualifying seeing temperatures soar up to 38 degrees Celsius and a track temperature of 66 degrees Celsius, the Dallas Grand Prix had a shaky start to say the least. This all got worse by the time Sunday's race arrived. Because of the heat experienced during qualifying, it was decided to move the start 3 hours forward to 11 AM to avoid the highest temperatures of the day. The damage to the asphalt noted by drivers on Friday was also getting worse. For some reason, a 50-lap Can-Am event was raced at the same circuit the day before, and the massive tyres of the Can-Ams had ripped up the tarmac even more. Repairs had to be done throughout the night, and by the time the flag was set to fall, the repairs would still be unfinished, primarily due to quick-drying cement being used. Normally this would be fine, but the boiling heat of the Texas sun didn't allow it to set correctly. This led to an attempted driver-led boycott, with the championship leaders Alain Prost and Niki Lauda apparently refusing to race. However, it will be the voices of 1982 champion Keke Rosberg, who didn't see what all the fuss was about, and Bernie Ecclestone, who was of course thinking about TV viewership and money, that would eventually convince the grid to have the race go ahead. Nigel Mansell, who started from his first ever pole position in his Lotus, would lead over half of the race, but behind him the Dallas GP was anything but smooth. René Arnoux was unable to start his car on the grid in the heat, and Derek Warwick, looking to overtake Mansell, would spin on lap 11. Rather quickly a breakaway formed of Mansell, Elio De Angelis, Lauda, Rosberg and Prost. Rosberg was the MVP of this race, overtaking all but Mansell, his quick reflexes being of major aid in the heat, assisted by a water-cooled skull cap keeping him cool and alert, which eventually allowed him to overtake Mansell for the lead. The rest of the grid, however, was quickly falling apart in the heat, and by lap 25, 8 drivers had retired. Reigning world champion Nelson Piquet would be the 9th after crashing into a wall. This would be followed in similar vein by Prost, who, after briefly taking the lead from Rosberg, would also hit a wall and had to retire due to a resulting puncture. Even the rookie sensation Ayrton Senna was not immune, as he too would retire after colliding with a wall. He would famously declare it wasn't his fault, but that the wall itself had moved. What initially seemed like a childish tantrum turned out to be true. The wall had in fact moved around 10mm further onto the track as a result of an earlier accident. Really goes to show the accuracy and consistency of the Brazilian wonder, even in his maiden F1 season. The circuit's final trick was played on initial race leader Nigel Mansell. After, you guessed it, colliding with a wall, Mansell's damaged car came to a halt on the final straight. Refusing to throw in the towel, Mansell jumped out and began to push his Lotus to the finish line, but rather quickly succumbed to the heat and collapsed on the tarmac. He was, however, classified as finishing 6th. Keke Rosberg, being up at the front, would avoid all of this carnage, and led René Arnoux and Elio De Angelis home for Dallas's only ever F1 podium. It was fair to say that the Dallas Grand Prix was a major failure. The poor conditions of the track and the Texan sun proved too much for all but 8 drivers, one of which collapsed due to heat exhaustion. Dallas was therefore a one-off, and was replaced by the Australian Grand Prix for the 1985 championship. Despite Formula 1 successfully returning to Texas in 2012, though this time in Austin and, more importantly, in October, the Lone Star State will always be known as hosting the Grand Prix that melted the grid. Maybe not the most prestigious accomplishment ever, but it's something, right? Episode 7. Going for First. The 1992 British Touring Car Championship was a hard-fought battle for John Cleland and his Vauxhall Cavalier all season long. Despite a very strong first half of the season, the second half saw him begin to falter, and by the time the championship reached the 15th and final round at Silverstone, Cleland found himself with just a 3-point lead over BMW driver Tim Harvey, who himself had a 1-point lead over Toyota driver Will Hoy. With just 4 points separating the top 3, the race at Silverstone was going to be a true final battle. However, despite the 3 drivers being so closely placed at the top of the pack, Cleland, Hoy and Harvey qualified rather dismally in 7th, 9th and 12th respectively. These 3 were going to have to fight for their points. And fight they did, and each of them will begin picking up places left and right, and by the midpoint of the race they were in a 3-car train from 4th to 6th place. Hoy and Harvey, who were ahead of Cleland, would then get into a closely fought battle for 4th. As the two headed into copse side by side, Harvey would drift wide and send Hoy onto the grass. Cleland snatched at this opportunity and passed the both of them. With just 2 more laps to go, all he had to do was maintain 4th and he would win the championship. However, another BMW driver, Steve Soper, who had had a previous accident earlier in the race and sustained rear-end damage, also managed to slip through behind Cleland. He would then impressively make it past the Vauxhall as well despite his damaged BMW, a move that Cleland wasn't exactly fond of.
Cleland is sandwiched between the two BMWs. I'm going for first, says John Cleland.
Still, 5th would be good enough to secure Cleland the championship. But it wasn't over yet. Harvey, who was now right behind Cleland, had gotten a good exit out of Abbey, and he was able to slip up the inside of the Cavalier, and after a bit of a battle, eventually managed to pass him. His teammate, Soper, let Harvey through and then moved in behind him to defend against Cleland. As the race's finish grew ever closer, unless he wanted to see a season's worth of work slip through his fingers, Cleland knew he had to make a move, and fast. He would dive to the inside of Soper going round Brooklands, but the BMW would not budge. The two cars collided, and the Cavalier briefly found itself up on two wheels, though the move had put Cleland slightly ahead of Soper, who then returned a dive to Cleland going into Luffield, and the two cars yet again collided. However, this time would be the last, as the two cars spun out into the barriers, and both Soper and Cleland were forced to retire. Harvey was then able to cross the line in 4th to a comfortable finish, winning the championship with 152 points. A dejected yet enraged Cleland demoted to 3rd at just 145.
I mean, what are we doing here? Is this stock car racing or is this motorsport? He might get away with that in Germany where he might be Mr. Superstar. But this is clean. The man's an animal.
Despite Andy Rouse being the eventual winner of the final round of the season, his victory is largely overshadowed by the battle for 5th, which would eventually see the championship leader be punted out at the last minute. It is easy to feel sorry for Cleland, but with 2 British Touring Car Championship drivers' titles and a number of wins to his name, if anything, his antics at Silverstone in 1992 make him much more memorable in the history books than his rivals. At the very least, he's probably one of the very few people who have ever managed to flip a Vauxhall Cavalier onto just 2 wheels, and that in itself is a massive achievement. Episode 8 Rock Out. Colin McRae was a rally driver well known for crashing his cars quite regularly. He seemed to have a certain knack for being able to throw himself off the road in the most spectacular fashion. However, what's less well known is his resourcefulness and ingenuity when it comes to getting his cars going again after the fact. When you're out on a rally stage nowhere near service, it's near impossible to fix major problems with the car. However, at the 1998 Rally Argentina, McRae proved that sometimes all you need is a little elbow grease and the environment around you. Going into Argentina at the midpoint of the season, McRae had a slim 2-point lead over Toyota driver Carlos Sainz. This round would be key to more firmly establish this lead. However, right out of the gate, it proved to be a tough battle with reigning world champion Tommy Mäkinen in his Lancer Evo instead. McRae would post some great times, coming out on top through multiple stages. However, going through the, sorry if I butcher this, the La Toma Giulio Cesare stage proved to be where McRae's dominant streak would come to an end. McRae would summit a crest and crash into a boulder sat in the middle of the road, and it completely destroyed his rear right suspension.
What's that? Big rock on the road.
It was such a bad hit that the wheel was effectively part of the bodywork, being crushed inside the wheel arch and stuck fast. McRae had no choice but to complete the stage with one wheel down, and most drivers at this point would throw in the towel. I mean, how could you continue after that? After surveying the damage at the end of the stage, he decided that the first port of call was getting the wheel off, but with it stuck inside the wheel arch, this was going to be impossible by conventional means. Instead, he set off on the next road section with the wheel still on, and with some enthusiastic driving, the tyre eventually blew. What was revealed was not a pleasant sight to say the least. The track control arm, a key component in the suspension setup, was badly bent. The car may still be drivable, but not to any viable degree. With no spare and the next service being miles away, it looked like the end of the road for the Scot. However, a nearby spectator, who also happened to be a mechanic, had a suggestion. why not anchor the link down with a few rocks and smash it back into shape? And so that's exactly what McRae did, and after a few good hits with a big boulder, the link might not have been completely straight, but it was a damn sight better than what it was.
We all assumed when we saw the car drive past on the road, we thought, you know, being realistic, that's the end of it. And when he came back on the radio and said he'd managed to take it off, straighten it and put it back on, we just speechless.
With the link back on and a new tyre fitted, McRae was back on his way. Unfortunately, the escapades with the rocky repair gave them a 2.5 minute penalty as they made it to control with mere seconds to spare. However, despite being relegated to 5th, not only was McRae still in the rally, but no less eager to post some amazing times, and miraculously, he would post the fastest time on the following stage. Despite his solid lead being dashed in an instant and being handed a consolation prize of 5th at the end of the rally, McRae's showing at the 1998 Rally Argentina remains one of his all-time best. It also goes to show that even with all the tech and gadgets of the modern world, sometimes all you need to succeed in life is some ingenuity and a bloody big rock.